If you are at the Supreme Court or study it, these teeny glacial movements are dramatic in the very decorous terms of the court. And Supreme Court watchers spent the whole year just yeah, one after the other, sort of seismic kinds of moves. Let's stick with this remarkable public commentary that started in the term, has continued in the summer. So we've had just in the last few weeks public speeches, very contrasting, by the Chief Justice and by Justice Kagan. Something, well, for you've never seen this summer, but even let alone during the term. What, Greg? What'd you sort of make of that? How extraordinary, and where were they both coming from? Because they're very used to, staying quiet and doing their work only through the written opinions.
Yeah, well, I thought Kagan's remarks were especially remarkable. Actually, back up. Those are the two justices on this court. If there are any two justices on the wings who talk to each other, who can actually work together sometimes, it's those two. So the fact that they're going in different directions tells you something. But what she basically said, now she didn't name names, she didn't name particular cases, but she says, a court can lose its legitimacy, and that was the word, when it does things like decides a case differently because the members of the court have changed, when it is reaching out to do more than it needs to do in a particular case. And that word legitimacy is something that is near and dear to John Roberts' heart. So he's conservative, no question, but he also cares very much, as Chief Justice, in preserving the court's institutional integrity and the perception of legitimacy. And the fact that they split in that direction in a way that I'm sure, and actually Justice Kagan was the one who sort of started it. She spoke at the Ninth Circuit shortly after the term and said those things and then repeated them more recently. She is undoubtedly feeling a member of the majority, that she's somebody who would like to work with the majority and try to, limit what they do. But she's, at this point with this 6-3 court, really powerless to do a whole lot. So this was kind of her way of framing in big picture terms what she sees the court as doing, not just because of what's in the rulings and what she's commenting on then in those, but also the kind of the bigger picture of, we've had this massive shift in the membership of the court, and we have different justices, and because they are different justices, they are changing the results.
And she's a very savvy justice, and this was a cheeky comment, legitimacy. She didn't just choose that as she was sitting there. So, is she hoping somehow to actually influence the members? Is she talking more to the country? What did you make of those comments?
Well, so I wanted just to contrast her view of legitimacy with
everybody
the Chief
know about
Justice's.
Elena Kagan's comment, Justice Kagan? But it's basically, as Greg summarized, the court risks damaging its own legitimacy when big changes in the law follow changes in the court's membership.
So. And Chief Justice Roberts had, I think, a very different understanding of legitimacy. His point was, there have been lots of moments where people have disagreed with decisions of the court, but they've never questioned the court's legitimacy. And so the idea was, all of the hubbub around Dobbs is really because people didn't like the decision, not because the decision was necessarily illegitimate. And Justice Kagan, I think her remarks were a rejoinder to that. Like, no, everyone sees that this decision would not have happened but for this change in the court's personnel. And that can't be how the public understands our work. So I don't know if she is trying to be conciliatory, trying to build a bridge. It didn't seem like it was a very good bridge. I actually think she's speaking to the public. Like, this is your institution. What do you think about what's happened? You seem to know, have an inkling about what has happened here. What are we all going to do about it? And maybe it's to sort of let her colleagues know that this is really grave. And I don't think it's just about Dobbs. I mean, yes, Virginia, there is a select committee. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on around the court that gives the public the perception that the court is not necessarily doing law, but is deeply, deeply enmeshed in politics. And that's not entirely the justice's fault. This is likely the confluence of both what they've done in Dobbs, what has been happening on the sort of periphery of the court, and also how the court is constituted, like Mitch McConnell taking a seat and holding it. all of this gives the public the perception that the court is deeply, deeply enmeshed in politics.
Can I just add to that? I think also Kagan would never say this because it's not her style. But part of what I think is exacerbating the legitimacy conversation is the behavior of the conservative justices outside of the building.
Yes.
Right? Justice Thomas goes to AEI and gives his talk. Justice Barrett gives a talk about how we're not partisan hacks at the Mitch McConnell Center.
With Mitch McConnell on the dais.
With Mitch McConnell on the dais. Barrett gives a talk in April at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library where she says, surely now in retrospect, knowing what's coming, she says, guys, don't just read the press about us, read our opinions, read the decisions. 2 days later, she's the decisive vote in a 5-4 Clean Water Act case where there is no opinion to read, right? So, there comes a point where you
Alito.
Right,
Yeah.
Alito.
With a new
Say no more.
I mean, Alito, starts the term with a speech at Notre Dame Law School last year, defending what he refuses to call the shadow docket, right, by misdescribing what it actually is. And then he ends the term with a speech in Rome, right, about how religion is still under threat in America. And so I think we have to sort of John Roberts is not them. He's not the one going out giving those speeches. But he is the one who dissents in Obergefell and says Obergefell is lawless, right? And so I think there's a degree to which I think it's worth stressing that part of the legitimacy crisis the court is facing is one that the conservative justices are not just doing nothing to alleviate, but are doing, I think, quite visible things to exacerbate. And I think it's worth putting words on that because that kind of behavior, they're not sort of scaling back that behavior. If anything, they're ratcheting it up.
Let's just stick with this for one second. So, okay, I mean, obviously, Justice Kagan and the two others on the left have very, very few cards to play. Nevertheless, it's striking that this kind of critical public commentary. What's the goal? Is it can't be just to let off steam, right?
No, it's not just to let off steam. I think the way you said it is very much what it is. It is the only card they have to play. As I said, Kagan is, so go back to when we had that 8-justice court for 14 months or so. And we saw the court doing a lot of consensus things where, and it was really four of them. It was on the right, Roberts and Kennedy, on the left, Breyer and Kagan, really working together. And Kagan does that very well. Breyer did that very well. And Kagan, I think, would still like to do that. Kagan likes to, she sees a majority opinion. If she can get them to soften it a little bit, she might join it. That's how she works as a justice. She doesn't instinctively always go to the really strong dissent. But she is increasingly now, she's in a position where, yeah, maybe she could convince Roberts of something. But she has to convince Roberts and somebody else. And she doesn't have, that's just too big of a hill even for her to climb. So I think both in her dissents, and I mean, you see it in what she writes as well. I go back a couple years ago, one of her, maybe her strongest dissent ever was in the partisan gerrymandering case from a couple years ago, where the court said federal courts don't have a role in saying that's too partisan under the Constitution. But since there are fewer and fewer occasions for her to do anything about this court, these are the cards she has to play. And she's still choosing her words carefully. She is not, in those comments this summer, she did not say this particular decision, this particular, so she's still got that, political ability. But, I think that's just what we're going to see from probably all three of them. I'm sure we'll talk more about Ketanji Brown Jackson later.
Well, can I just add something, though? So I think the way that Justice Kagan has operated in the past in tandem with Justice Breyer is to sort of put a finger in the dike, trim back and make things more incremental. You can't, that's irrelevant if you have the rest of the court, full throttle, let's do it. You only live once. And so it may also be a recognition that the tactics that have worked in the past to sort of limit the court aren't really going to be effective against a 5-person majority that seems intent on doing the most.
And I think we're seeing, there are, there's this sort of small, but I think really significant body of cases where it's 5-4 with Roberts and the liberals in dissent.
Yeah.
Right, and I think it's there where those are the opinions where Kagan is not pulling her punches, right? In SB 8, in the Alabama election case from February, right, in the Clean Water Act case in April, because there she's not trying to mollify John Roberts. She has John Roberts, right, and she's trying to make the broader point.
It's actually quite a contrast. It used to be in her first few terms that the final days of the term would feature a huge sort of a Lee versus Frazier, Roberts versus Kagan. That's when she would really have her biggest fire and some of her most memorable dissents. And now, as you say, this is sort of her closest ally.